Now, with the recent victories that the Americans had had, the British were not happy. So they put together a plan, a battle plan. It involved taking Albany, New York, and gaining control of the Hudson River, and thereby separating the New England states from the Middle states. This would allow them to focus specifically on the New England states without any assistance. The New England states couldn't get any help. This was a three-pronged attack. Now, if you remember history, not always are three-pronged attacks the best way to go. There were three generals, Burgoyne, St. Leger, and Howe. Now, Burgoyne was going to come from the north, from Canada, and move down south, meeting at Albany, New York. St. Leger was going to come from Lake Ontario, which is from the east, and General Howe was going to come up north from New York City. The goal was to completely surround the Americans. Now, Howe made a decision to capture Philadelphia before marching into Albany. Now, he did this strategically because the Americans put up zero fight over Philadelphia. Our entire history is in Philadelphia. It's where they established the Continental Congress. That's where the Declaration of Independence was signed. So Americans did not fight the British. They basically gave up Philadelphia with very... Now, while there was great success with General Howe's group, St. Leger was not having good success. He was being slowed down and finally halted at Fort Stanwix, New York. Burgoyne wasn't making progress either. Rough terrain, and Americans were using that to their benefit. And so, in need of food and supplies, Burgoyne sent troops into Bennington, Vermont, to capture the military stores. And Burgoyne was forced to retreat to Saratoga, which leads to the Battle of Saratoga. Burgoyne faced serious problems at Saratoga. Serious problems. He realizes that the other forces are not coming. Remember, there's no cell phones. They can't communicate to know that the other two aren't showing up. He was surrounded by an army 3 times the size of his own. And on October 17th, 1777, Burgoyne was forced to surrender. Huge defeat for the British. So the war continues. Now, American victory in Saratoga was a huge turning point in the war. You see, Benjamin Franklin had been trying to get French support. He was in France, in fact, during much of the war, trying to get French support. The Americans knew that they could not take on the British all on their own, and who better to help them than the French, who hated the British? So with the victory in Saratoga, France agreed to support the United States. They did all sorts of things. They declared war on Britain. They sent money and equipment and supplies to the United States, including naval ships. This would be very important to the Americans. Other countries also decided to support the United States, Spain, and the Netherlands. Now, most of these countries that supported the United States absolutely despised the British. Spain sent in money, rifles, and other supplies. And we have to remember that at the time, Spain controlled much of the South and the Southwest. Florida was under Spanish control. And so it wasn't difficult for Spanish troops to simply capture British forts along the Mississippi Valley. Netherlands also went to war. They loaned money to the Americans. All of this is vitally important. Now we come across winter again, 1777-78. Howe and his men are sleeping comfortably in Philadelphia. But Washington had to establish his camp at a different location. In this terrible, terrible winter, they lacked food, clothing, and shelter. He had once again struggled keeping the army together with deserters and those that resigned. And all of this is the most famous winter camp probably in American history. His camp was located at Valley Forge. From the images, life was not very good. Now remember, these are artist renditions probably long after the fact. Conditions would improve, however, because Washington sent his troops to start building huts and gathering food and doing whatever they needed to survive the winter. And they did. So we've been greatly focused on the war in the northern part, especially in the New England colonies. But there was war in the west and in the south. In fact, Britain had been invading western settlers. And this guy, by the name of George Rogers Clark, set out to stop these British attacks on western settlers. The British found the Westerners to be very vulnerable. They were away from civilizations and wanted to ensure that they did not continue to move out further west. So in June 1778, Clark and 175 Minutemen, soldiers, sailed to the Tennessee River, where they then marched 120 miles to seize the British post of Kaskaskia. Once they finished that, they seized the town of Vincennes. Now, they did this very successfully. The British were not going to let the Americans just walk in and take it. So in December, the British recaptured Vincennes from the Americans. But by February 1779, Clark and his troops surprised the British forces, forced them to surrender, and really strengthened the American position in the West. There's not a whole lot of fighting occurring in the West. Now remember, we're still just talking about the Appalachian Mountains. That's as far west as Americans really are. That's the edge of the American colony, the American states. Now at sea, the British, as we talked about, they were dominant, very dominant with their navy. And they were preventing American ships and Allied ships from entering or leaving the ports. American ships were built, but few of them actually made it to sea, so we use almost extensively privateers, privately owned merchant ships that had been equipped with weapons. And they were able to capture, obviously, more British vessels than the American Navy because the American Navy stunk. So,